Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about the progressive movement. The progressive movement comes in response to all the problems due to industrialization, and tons of people get involved. It's a huge movement, but it's mostly white, middle class men and women who are part of this movement. And women are especially involved in this movement because they see it as an extension of their roles as mothers and providing civic virtue for their children. Many women don't try to argue that they're getting involved in politics and stepping outside of their sphere that the cult of domesticity demands. Instead, they argue it's an extension of these ideas, like protecting children from labor, getting rid of drunkenness, or making sure the meat that comes into their home isn't absolutely disgusting. But really, all people supported the progressive movement. It was very popular in the United States at this time. Progressives had three main goals. They wanted to stop the trusts from taking advantage of people. They wanted to stop socialism, which is the idea that the government controls more things like business production. Instead, they wanted to preserve capitalism and fix things by creating more democracy or giving people more voting rights so they can help make changes. And they also wanted to fix many of societal problems like prostitution, drunkenness, things like that. Let's take a look at how progressive reform began in the early 1900s. When we talked in our previous unit, we looked at the government's attempt to control the trust, like the Interstate Commerce Act, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC. It prohibited rebates and pools and made railroads publish their prices. The other one we discussed in depth was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was supposed to hurt the trusts, but actually ended up hurting the labor unions instead. Both were not as effective as the people wanted, but it was an early form of progressivism. Another part of progressive reform is the social gospel movement. This idea was influenced by Christianity. People who were part of this movement used religion as a way to argue that better living conditions and houses and apartments were needed for the poor. Church members really got involved in the progressive era because of their beliefs. This also led to the creation of the Salvation Army. It was created during this time to provide food for the homeless, education for immigrants, and it also supported ideas of temperance, which is the idea of banning alcohol. Similar to the Salvation Army, settlement houses were also formed during this time with the idea of helping close the gap between the rich and the poor. They provided education courses in things like cooking, English, and sewing, which would all be beneficial in helping people get a job. They also gave college-educated women a place to focus their attention and their good works. It was still seen as a little unacceptable for middle class women to get involved in politics at this time. Remember, they still don't have the right to vote nationwide, or it was even seen as unacceptable for them to have jobs that were considered men's work. But working in a settlement house was seen as an extension of this woman's motherly role, so society at the time allowed it. The most famous settlement house was the one that Jane Addams created in Chicago called Hull House, which we've mentioned before. Progressive reform, like Jane Addams' work with Hull House, often started at the local level before working its way to the national level. Many progressives began to pressure their local governments to provide better parks and community services, or they wanted to ban prostitution, especially in places like the red light districts where it was everywhere, or they wanted to get rid of slumlords or juvenile delinquents. After progressives began to push for these changes, the local governments realized they needed to do something. So many cities created a new job called a city manager who would oversee these changes. After these local level changes were successful and, most importantly, popular among the people, progressive reform also moved to the state level. A good example of this is when Hiram Johnson became governor of California and brought a lot of changes. For example, he stopped Southern Pacific Railroad from using their wealth and influence to control politics. Another part of progressivism was the push for women to gain the right to vote. Feminists, or sometimes they were called suffragettes, women who wanted to gain the right to vote, worked hard during the progressive era to make sure women finally earned this right. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were both still involved in the women's rights movement. If you remember, they were really important for the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls in 1848. They created the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890 to help continue this fight. but now they're kind of old. And it was Carrie Chapman Catt who should really be credited during this time with making a lot of changes. She and the other women involved decided that they should shift their argument. They used to argue that women were equal to men and that's why they deserved the right to vote. But they realized this was causing people to not agree with their cause. So instead, they changed their tactics and began to say that women have a special responsibility to take care of the health of their family and the education of their children. And what better way to carry out these traditional roles than if they were given the right to vote? When they began to link the women's voting rights to their traditional roles, this influenced more people to support their cause. And lots of local elections and states like Wyoming, states especially in the West, give women the right to vote. Although it still takes until 1919 for the 19th Amendment to pass and women to gain the right to vote nationwide. It is also important to note that Black women were not allowed to join the National American Women's Suffrage Association, so they created their own National Association of Colored Women in 1896, and they worked for voting rights as well as anti-lynching laws. The last area where progressive reform really became popular was through people nicknamed muckrakers. Muckrakers were like investigative journalists who went into the cities and exposed the evil and corruption there. Basically, they found all the dirt that the public loved to read about. There are a few examples you should know. The first is Lincoln Steffens. He wrote a series of articles called The Shame of the Cities, where he wrote about the corrupt alliances that businesses were creating with the local governments. Another person is Ida Tarbell, whose work was actually published in the same magazine as Lincoln Steffens, and she wrote about the corruption of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. She was super passionate about this topic because her dad was ruined by the oil trusts. And of course, you should remember Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book The Jungle about the meat packing plant. Another person who isn't on this list but should be is Jacob Riis. If you remember, we looked at some of his pictures he took of the slums in the cities. All of these were part of the progressive movement. So it should give you an idea just how big it was in the United States at this time. All right, now let's look at how progressives worked to achieve their goals. One of their goals was to eliminate corruption in the government at all levels. The muckrakers had discovered evidence of congressmen taking bribes from companies, so progressives were determined to stop this. Plus, by 1900, the Senate had so many rich men that people began to call it the Millionaires Club. Not that it's much better now. But they did work to gain direct election of U.S. senators to help stop this. And in 1913, they passed the 17th Amendment that does exactly this, which gives the people more power over Congress, although it doesn't fully get rid of the corruption. They also wanted to pass things called the initiative, referendum, and recall, which would help give people more influence over government. The initiative allows people to propose laws themselves, which would take away the need of relying on politicians who were corrupt. The referendum puts laws on the ballot for the people to have a final approval on, and the recall would let the voters remove a corrupt politician from office, like someone who was being bribed by the party bosses or lobbyists. Progressives also wanted to give women the right to vote, as we just discussed, other than just believing that women deserve the right to vote, because women are just as intelligent as men. But they also thought that if you give women the right to vote, then that leads to more voters. And more voters means more people who are able to end the corruption in government. Progressives also really wanted to stop the trusts. We already talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act that was pretty ineffective at stopping trusts. Actually, it hurts labor unions more, but the progressives were successful in getting other laws passed later on, like the Elkins Act in 1903, which was much more successful in stopping the big railroad companies than the Interstate Commerce Act was. It would now fine railroad companies that gave rebates and fine the businesses that accepted them. This is a big change because under the Interstate Commerce Act, they could just appeal the decision with the courts, and that could take 10 years to come to a decision, which means they were allowed to continue giving those rates that whole time. The Elkins Act stops this, so it was way more successful. The Hepburn Act, passed in 1906, was even more effective. It gave the Interstate Commerce Commission more power. For example, now they could set a maximum price for railroad companies, so they couldn't charge people more than that price. And this act stopped railroad companies from giving free passes to companies that use their railroads a lot. Basically, those companies were bribing railroad companies in exchange for a free pass, so this act stops the bribes. Progressives also made trust busting popular. Presidents like Roosevelt, Taft, and then later Wilson campaign in support of progressive reform ideas, and especially on stopping the influence of trusts. The Clayton Antitrust Act is the one I would really like you to remember, though, because it makes for a really good comparison with how things change because of the progressive movement. If you remember, again, we talked about how the Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to stop the trusts from taking advantage of people, but it actually hurt the labor unions. Well, in 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act strengthens the ideas from the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it makes it very clear that labor unions should be allowed and that workers are allowed to strike peacefully. It also makes it illegal to have interlocking directorates, which is when the same person serves as the director of two competing companies as a way to set higher prices for both those businesses. So the Clayton Antitrust Act, unlike the Sherman one, was really effective. The last method I want to talk about is the way progressives tried to stop the bad effects of these really big businesses. For example, if you remember us reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and all the disgusting things that happened to the meat, actually, there was a popular jingle at the time that went, "Mary had a little lamb, and when she saw it sicken, she shipped it off to packing town, and now it's labeled chicken." So obviously progressives wanted to fix this, and their work helped pass the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which gave the government the right to inspect the meat and make sure the food is labeled correctly, which I'm sure we are all very thankful for. Roosevelt also passed several laws to begin to protect the land from big businesses. I'm going to dive into the presidents and their progressive policies at another time, but just remember that Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson did support progressive ideas in their campaigns and during their presidencies. And finally, in 1916, they passed the Child Labor Act, which stops goods from being shipped to another state if a child under the age of 14 was working, although it was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So as you can see, progressives were really involved and pretty effective in bringing about change during this time period. Okay, to finish off this video, I quickly want to make a comparison with the populist movement and the progressive movement. This could make for a good essay question or a short answer question. I already went over both movements in detail, but let's just compare a few of their similarities and differences. The populist movement was a farmer movement, while the progressive movement mostly involved the middle class and the people in the cities. Both movements were caused by the problems created due to industrialization, although their problems look slightly different. Farmers were concerned about the railroads and the banks, while progressives dealt with all the big businesses. Some solutions were the same, like the desire for regulation of the railroads, direct election of U.S. senators, as well as the initiative and referendum, which would give people more say in the laws that are being passed. The biggest difference is that the progressive movement is very successful and the populist movement, not so much. Their party fails after William Jennings Bryan lost the 1896 election. I'm going to leave you with a practice question that is a long essay question. It is: analyze the roles that women played in the progressive era reforms in the 1880s through 1920. Focus your essay on two of the following: politics, social conditions, or labor and working conditions. Pause the video here, think about how you would answer this question, and then check out the potential evidence in the description below. Hope you guys have a great day.